When German prisoners of war first received money in American camps, many of them dismissed it as a mistake or a temporary measure meant to serve some unclear purpose. But as the weeks passed and the payments continued to arrive with quiet consistency, always on time and always without explanation, the confusion they felt began to change into something far more unsettling, because repetition transforms meaning. And what happens again and again stops feeling accidental and starts feeling deliberate. They had prepared themselves to endure hunger, punishment, and humiliation, yet they found themselves facing a routine that did not break down, did not fluctuate with mood or circumstance, and did not ask for gratitude in return, a routine that simply continued week after week, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable reality that this was not an exception, but a system. And it was at that moment, when the payments stopped feeling strange and started feeling permanent, that fear quietly returned, not as shock, but as a deeper question they did not yet know how to answer. At first, the weekly payments did not feel important because money had no meaning inside captivity, and survival had always depended on obedience rather than currency. But as the routine repeated itself with mechanical precision, the prisoners began to realize that what disturbed them was not the amount they were given, but the certainty with which it arrived, because certainty implied intention. And intention implied a system that expected something in return, even if it never said what that something was. They started counting time differently, not by days of captivity or rumors of the war's progress, but by the quiet rhythm of envelopes and vouchers that appeared at the same moment each week. And this realization unsettled them deeply, because waiting for payment from an enemy felt dangerously close to depending on him, and dependence was a line they feared crossing without noticing. Some tried to ignore the money entirely, hiding it away as if refusing to touch it might protect them from whatever meaning it carried, while others spent it cautiously on small necessities, convincing themselves that practicality did not equal acceptance. Yet none of them could escape the sense that repetition was slowly reshaping their expectations in ways they could not control. What frightened them most was not the fear of punishment, but the absence of it, because nothing was taken away when they questioned the payments, nothing changed when they accepted them, and nothing explained why the system continued unchanged, leaving them alone with a growing suspicion that the real test was not endurance, but adaptation. And it was there, in that quiet space between suspicion and routine, that the prisoners began to understand that this story was not about money at all, but about how consistency can alter belief more effectively than force ever could. The first payment had been dismissed as an anomaly, something the prisoners could explain away without much effort, because war was full of temporary measures and strange decisions that made little sense in the moment, but rarely lasted long enough to matter. What they had not prepared for was repetition, because repetition removed uncertainty and replaced it with structure, and structure, even when offered by an enemy, demanded to be acknowledged. At the end of the first week, the payments arrived quietly, distributed without ceremony and without explanation, recorded in ledgers that were never shown, and handled by guards who treated the process as administrative rather than symbolic. The prisoners accepted the money cautiously, some holding it as if it might vanish, others folding it away immediately, convinced that treating it as real would make it real in ways they were not ready to face. When the second week passed and the payments arrived again, on the same day and at nearly the same hour, curiosity replaced disbelief. Men compared amounts in hushed voices, confirming that no mistake had been made and that the distribution followed a pattern rather than chance. No one spoke openly about what it meant, but the unspoken question settled into every corner of the camp, persistent and unresolved. By the third week, denial was no longer possible. The payments were not a reward, nor were they leverage, and they were certainly not charity. They followed rules the prisoners could not see but were forced to accept, because the consistency itself carried authority. A system that repeated itself without deviation signaled confidence, and confidence from an enemy felt dangerous in ways unpredictability never had. The camp's routines adjusted subtly around this new certainty. Men began to plan their days differently, measuring time not by meals or roll calls, but by the space between payments. This shift was small at first, almost imperceptible, yet it altered how captivity was experienced. Time, once defined by waiting and uncertainty, now had markers that arrived reliably, whether the prisoners acknowledged them or not. Some men refused to engage with the money at all, leaving it untouched in their lockers as proof that they had not accepted the system it represented. Others used it cautiously, purchasing necessities from the camp canteen and convincing themselves that practicality did not equal dependence. Both responses were attempts to control the meaning of the payments, to define the terms before the system defined them instead. The guards offered no guidance. They neither encouraged spending nor discouraged saving, maintaining the same neutrality that governed every other aspect of camp life. This absence of commentary was itself unsettling, because it suggested that the meaning of the payments was not something to be negotiated or explained, but something the prisoners were expected to live with and interpret on their own. As weeks accumulated, the money ceased to be an object and became a symbol, though no one could agree on what it symbolized. For some, it represented fairness enforced by law rather than sentiment. For others, it felt like a quiet intrusion, a way of normalizing captivity by making it resemble civilian life too closely. The discomfort came not from disagreement, but from the realization that both interpretations could exist at the same time. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the amount they received, but the predictability with which it arrived. Predictability implied permanence, and permanence implied acceptance, whether they wanted it or not. A one-time payment could be rejected mentally, but a weekly routine demanded accommodation, and accommodation felt uncomfortably close to adaptation. In private moments, men wondered what would happen if the payment stopped, whether the sudden absence would feel like punishment or relief. This thought alone revealed how deeply the routine had already embedded itself, because only something that had become expected could leave a noticeable void when removed. The war beyond the wire continued to shift unpredictably, rumors of advances and retreats passing through the camp without confirmation. Yet inside the camp, one thing remained constant. Every week, the payments arrived, indifferent to battles, headlines, or hope. This contrast between chaos outside and consistency inside intensified the unease, because it suggested that captivity operated according to rules entirely separate from the conflict that had created it. By the end of the first month, the prisoners no longer asked whether the payments would continue. They asked what it meant that they already knew the answer. The system had not forced compliance or demanded gratitude. It had succeeded in reshaping expectations simply by being reliable. And in that reliability, the prisoners began to understand that the true disturbance was not the money itself, but the quiet realization that routine could transform captivity without ever raising its voice. As the weekly payments settled into routine, a new discomfort quietly emerged, one that did not announce itself through fear or resistance, but through familiarity, because what repeats long enough stops being questioned and begins to be relied upon, even when that reliance feels dangerous to admit. The prisoners did not speak openly about this shift, yet shaped their days with increasing clarity. The camp canteen became the most visible expression of this change. Shelves stocked with small necessities offered choices that had once seemed irrelevant: toothpaste, paper, extra soap, occasional treats that reminded the men of civilian life. At first, many approached the counter with hesitation, treating each purchase as a test rather than a privilege. Yet over time, the transactions became routine, conducted without ceremony, recorded without comment, and completed with the same neutrality that defined the rest of the camp. What unsettled the prisoners was not the act of spending money, but the realization that the system anticipated it. Prices were fixed. Supplies were replenished. Nothing suggested improvisation or experimentation. The camp functioned as if the payments were an established fact rather than an exception, and this assumption quietly pressured the men to adapt whether they wished to or not. Some prisoners attempted to resist by refusing to spend the money altogether, letting it accumulate and used as a form of silent protest. Others justified their purchases by necessity, convincing themselves that soap and paper did not represent comfort, but practicality. Both approaches were attempts to preserve a sense of moral distance, yet both failed to erase the deeper unease, because the system did not respond differently to either choice. Letters from home intensified this discomfort. News of shortages, destroyed cities, and families struggling to survive made the stability of camp life feel increasingly difficult to reconcile. The prisoners were safe, fed, and now quietly compensated, while the world they had left behind fractured under the weight of war. This contrast introduced a guilt that had no clear target because no rule had been broken and no cruelty imposed. The guards remained consistent, neither acknowledging the moral tension nor offering reassurance. Payments continued on schedule. Records were kept. Regulations were enforced evenly. This restraint denied the prisoners the emotional cues they expected, leaving them alone with the implications of their own adaptation. Without hostility to resist, dependence became harder to define and easier to deny. Conversations in the barracks reflected this growing conflict. Men spoke cautiously about what the money allowed them to do, yet avoided discussing what it represented. Some argued that accepting payment changed nothing, that captivity remained captivity regardless of compensation. Others worried that routine acceptance softened something essential, eroding the boundaries that made resistance meaningful. No resolution emerged because the system offered none. It neither demanded gratitude nor punished skepticism. It simply continued, week after week, functioning with a confidence that suggested permanence. This predictability transformed uncertainty into expectation, and expectation into dependence, even as the prisoners resisted naming it as such. Over time, the payments altered how the men understood their own survival. Endurance no longer meant resisting deprivation, but navigating stability without losing a sense of opposition. This was a more subtle challenge because it lacked clear measures of success or failure. There were no punishments avoided, no victories claimed, only adjustments made quietly and without acknowledgement. The war beyond the camp remained distant and abstract, its progress measured through rumors rather than facts. Yet inside the wire, the rhythm of payment provided a steady counterpoint. This contrast sharpened the psychological tension because it suggested that captivity operated according to rules independent of victory or defeat. By the end of the second month, the prisoners had stopped discussing whether the payments would continue and started grappling with what it meant that they expected them to. The system had not coerced compliance or demanded trust, yet it had succeeded in reshaping behavior through consistency alone. And in that quiet adaptation, many prisoners began to understand that dependence did not always announce itself as surrender, but often arrived disguised as routine, settling into daily life before anyone realized it had taken hold. As the weeks continued without interruption, the prisoners slowly realized that the payments were no longer something that happened to them, but something they had begun to anticipate, and this shift, subtle as it was, carried consequences they had not prepared for. Expectation changed how they experienced time, because what is expected becomes part of the mental landscape, shaping behavior even when it is resisted. Men no longer waited to see if payment would arrive, but noticed immediately if the day felt incomplete before it did. This awareness disturbed them more than surprise ever had, because it revealed how deeply the routine had already embedded itself. The money had not forced obedience, yet it had quietly altered attention, redirecting thought toward what would come next rather than what might go wrong. Attempts to distance themselves from this expectation took different forms. Some avoided the canteen entirely, choosing to live with fewer comforts rather than acknowledge dependence. Others spent their payments quickly and without thought, treating the money as something that passed through their hands without meaning. Neither approach offered relief, because expectation is not erased by denial, and routine does not disappear when it is ignored. The guards remained unchanged, continuing their duties with the same restraint that had defined the camp from the beginning. They did not monitor spending, nor did they comment on saving, reinforcing the sense that the system did not care how the prisoners responded, only that it continued to function. This indifference removed the possibility of framing adaptation as compliance, leaving the prisoners without a clear narrative to explain their behavior. What troubled them most was not the material effect of the payments, but the psychological adjustment they demanded. The routine had begun to replace uncertainty with predictability, and predictability carried its own pressure because it required acknowledgement. A system that could be counted on, even reluctantly, demanded accommodation, and accommodation felt dangerously close to acceptance. As expectation solidified, the prisoners faced a quiet reckoning. They could no longer claim that the payments were meaningless, nor could they fully explain why that meaning unsettled them so deeply. The routine had not removed fear, but it had reshaped it, transforming anxiety about punishment into unease about reliance. By the end of the third month, the question was no longer whether the payments mattered, but how much they already had. And in recognizing that shift, the prisoners began to understand that the most powerful changes did not arrive through force or shock, but through repetition that asked nothing and explained nothing, yet slowly altered what felt normal. As routine settled more firmly into daily life, the prisoners began to notice a feeling they had not expected to emerge from stability, which was guilt that did not come from wrongdoing, but from comparison. Inside the camp, life had acquired a rhythm that was predictable and controlled, while beyond the wire, the war continued to dismantle cities, families, and futures in ways that arrived only through fragmented rumors and delayed letters. News from home, when it reached the camp, carried stories of shortages, bombed neighborhoods, and uncertainty that stretched far beyond hunger. Relatives wrote about standing in long lines for food, about nights spent in cellars, about work that disappeared without explanation. These accounts collided sharply with the prisoner's own reality, where meals arrived on schedule, medical care was consistent, and weekly payments continued without interruption. The contrast was difficult to absorb. Many prisoners found themselves struggling to reconcile their relative stability with the chaos described in those letters, not because they believed they deserved punishment, but because safety itself had begun to feel undeserved. They had prepared themselves to suffer alongside their country, yet here they were, insulated from the worst effects of the war by a system that operated independently of victory or defeat. This dissonance deepened the psychological burden of the payments. The money was no longer just a routine or a source of discomfort, but a symbol of imbalance. Each week it arrived as a reminder that captivity had placed them in a strange position, neither fully removed from the war nor fully subjected to it. They were witnesses to destruction without being participants in it, protected by rules while others endured chaos. Some prisoners responded by withdrawing further, limiting their spending and avoiding conversation about home altogether. Others fixated on the letters, rereading familiar lines until the words lost meaning. hoping repetition might dull their impact. Neither approach resolved the underlying tension, because the system that provided stability offered no guidance on how to live with its consequences. The guards continued their routines without change, enforcing regulations with the same neutrality that had come to define camp life. There were no speeches acknowledging the war's progress, no gestures meant to reassure or condemn. This silence reinforced the sense that the camp existed outside moral commentary, functioning as an administrative space rather than a battlefield, and this separation left the prisoners alone with their interpretations. As weeks turned into months, the guilt became quieter but more persistent. It no longer surfaced as sharp discomfort, but as a steady pressure that accompanied ordinary moments, meals, work details, and evenings in the barracks. The prisoners were not being punished for surviving, yet survival itself had begun to feel complicated by the knowledge of what others were enduring beyond the wire. The payments, predictable and unchanged, intensified this feeling. They arrived regardless of news from home, indifferent to suffering elsewhere, reinforcing the sense that captivity followed rules that did not bend to emotion. This consistency made it impossible to frame their situation as temporary or exceptional, forcing the prisoners to confront the reality that their experience of the war was fundamentally different from that of those they had left behind. By the time the fourth month approached, many prisoners understood that the weight they carried was no longer fear of punishment or suspicion of a trap, but the quiet realization that they were living in relative stability while the world they came from was unraveling. This awareness did not produce anger or resistance, but a muted unease that settled into daily life. And in that unease, the prisoners began to grasp a difficult truth, which was that captivity had not removed them from responsibility, but had instead placed them in a position where survival itself demanded reckoning, not with an enemy, but with the moral distance between safety and suffering. As the months passed and the payments continued without interruption, the prisoners began to sense that the most unsettling change had already occurred quietly and without announcement, because what had once felt temporary had become stable, and stability inside captivity carried a danger they had not anticipated. The routine no longer needed to prove itself. It existed on its own, unquestioned and dependable. The money itself faded into the background of daily life, no longer examined with suspicion or discussed in whispers, yet its presence reshaped behavior all the same. Men planned small purchases without hesitation, adjusted habits without conscious decision, and spoke about the future using language that assumed continuity rather than disruption. This shift frightened many of them more than the payments ever had, because it suggested that adaptation had already taken place. What troubled the prisoners was not comfort, but normalization. Captivity was no longer defined solely by restriction or uncertainty, but by systems that functioned smoothly enough to be relied upon. The camp did not feel chaotic or provisional. It felt managed, predictable, and strangely insulated from the war that had created it. This predictability blurred the line between endurance and acceptance, leaving the prisoners unsure where they stood. Some men attempted to resist this normalization by reminding themselves that everything they experienced was temporary, yet the rhythm of daily life undermined these efforts. Each week that passed without disruption made the idea of permanence harder to dismiss. The system did not announce its intentions, but its consistency implied that it did not expect to be questioned. The guards remained unchanged, enforcing rules with quiet efficiency and offering no commentary on the passage of time. They did not mark milestones or acknowledge the prisoners' growing unease, reinforcing the impression that the camp existed outside emotional interpretation. This absence of reaction made it impossible to externalize blame or fear, forcing the prisoners to confront their discomfort internally. As rumors of the war's approaching end began to circulate, a new anxiety emerged. Freedom, once imagined as release, now felt uncertain. The outside world was described as unstable and damaged, while the camp had become structured and reliable. The contrast unsettled many prisoners because it inverted the logic they had relied upon to survive, turning captivity into the most predictable part of their lives. Men began to wonder, often in silence, how they would explain this experience if asked, how they would describe a captivity that had not relied on cruelty to exert control, but on routine and law. There was no simple narrative of suffering to hold on to, no clear injustice to point toward, only a memory of systems that had worked too well. By the time the 5th month approached, the prisoners understood that the most profound effect of the payments was not dependence on money, but dependence on structure. The routine had provided shape in a world defined by uncertainty, and that shape had quietly replaced the chaos they had prepared themselves to endure. This realization carried an uncomfortable truth. Captivity had not only restrained them, but had reorganized their expectations, teaching them to live within a system that demanded adjustment rather than resistance. The danger was not that they had suffered, but that they had adapted without fully noticing when the adaptation began. And as the weeks continued to pass without disruption, many prisoners sensed that the greatest challenge awaiting them was not surviving captivity, but leaving behind a structure that had become disturbingly familiar and facing a world where stability was no longer guaranteed. By the time the German prisoners fully accepted that the weekly payments were not a temporary wartime decision, but a structure that would continue regardless of battles, rumors, or hope, something inside them had already changed in ways they could not easily reverse. Because routine possesses a quiet authority that shock never achieves, and repetition reshapes belief more effectively than force ever could. What unsettled them most was not the money itself, but what it slowly replaced. Because fear had once organized their thoughts, uncertainty had once defined their days, and survival had once required constant vigilance. Yet now those instincts were being softened by predictability, by schedules that arrived on time, and by systems that functioned without anger or explanation. The payments did not erase captivity, nor did they offer freedom, but they introduced stability into a world shaped by chaos. And that stability carried its own weight, because it forced the prisoners to confront the uncomfortable truth that adaptation can occur without consent, and that reliance does not always announce itself as surrender. Years later, many former prisoners would struggle to explain why this experience lingered so quietly in their memory, because it left behind no single moment of cruelty to condemn and no clear injustice to point toward. Only the realization that captivity governed by law and routine could alter the human mind more deeply than punishment ever had. The weekly payments did not demand gratitude, obedience, or loyalty, yet they achieved something far more unsettling, which was the normalization of confinement through consistency, teaching the prisoners that systems do not need violence to exert control, only time, repetition, and restraint. And when the war finally ended and the gates opened, many carried with them a question they never fully answered, which was not whether captivity had been humane or cruel, but how easily a routine can become familiar, how quietly expectations can change, and how deeply a system can shape belief without ever raising its voice. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.